omens of the death of Valens and of the imminent Gothic disaster. Meanwhile, a rapid turn of fortune's wheel, which is perpetually alternating adversity and prosperity, was arming Bologna and her attendant furies, and bringing sad calamity upon the east. Its approach was plainly foreshadowed by omens and portents. Besides many true predictions from seers and augurs, dogs howled in answer to wolves, nightbirds burst into doleful shrieks, and gloomy dawns dimmed the bright light of morning. At Antioch, where quarrels and riots among the populace were common, it became the habit for anyone who thought himself wronged to shout boldly, "Burn Valens alive!" Criers could be heard constantly urging people to collect combustibles, to set fire to the baths of Valens, which had been built at the insistence of the emperor himself. This indicated almost in so many words the manner of his death. In addition, the ghostly likeness of the King of Armenia, and the pathetic shades of the victims of the recent affair of Theodorus, made the night hideous with dirge-like howls, and inspired dire terror. A heifer was found lying dead with its throat cut, and this was a sign of widespread misery and death among the public. Lastly, when the old walls of Chalcedon were being taken down to provide material for a bath at Constantinople, the removal of the stone revealed a square block hidden in the fabric, on which were inscribed in Greek the following verses, a clear indication of what was to come. Through the city's streets with garlands crowned, fresh maidens whirl rejoicing in the dance, and what was once a city's wall shall serve, oh what a mournful change, to guard a bath. Then countless hordes of men from lands afar shall cross fair Ista's river lance in hand, and lay all Scythia and Mysia waste. Next on Paeonia turn their mad career, to spread there likewise naught but death and strife. The nature of the Huns and Alans. The seedbed and origin of all this destruction, and of the various calamities inflicted by the wrath of Mars, which raged everywhere with unusual fury, I find to be this: the people of the Huns, who are mentioned only curiously in ancient writers, and who dwell beyond the Sea of Azov, near the frozen ocean, are quite abnormally savage. From the moment of birth they make deep gashes in their children's cheeks, so that when in due course hair appears, its growth is checked by the wrinkled scars. As they grow older, this gives them the unlovely appearance of beardless eunuchs. They have squat bodies, strong limbs, and thick necks, and are so prodigiously ugly and bent that they might be two-legged animals, or the figures crudely carved from stumps which are seen on the parapets of bridges. Still, their shape, however disagreeable, is human, but their way of life is so rough that they have no use for fire or seasoned food, but live on the roots of wild plants and the half-raw flesh of any sort of animal, which they warm a little by placing it between their thighs and the backs of their horses. They have no buildings to shelter them, but avoid anything of this kind as carefully as we avoid living in the neighbourhood of tombs. Not so much as a hut thatched with reeds is to be found amongst them. They roam at large over mountains and forests, and are endured from the cradle to cold, hunger, and thirst. On foreign soil only extreme necessity can persuade them to come under a roof, since they believe that it is not safe for them to do so. They wear garments of linen or of the skins of field mice stitched together, and there is no difference between their clothing whether they are at home or abroad. Once they have put their necks into some dingy shirt, they never take it off or change it until it rots and falls to pieces from incessant wear. They have round caps of fur on their heads, and protect their hairy legs with goat skins. Their shapeless shoes are not made on a last, and make it hard to walk easily. In consequence, they are ill-fitted to fight on foot, and remain glued to their horses, hardy but ugly beasts, on which they sometimes sit like women performing their everyday businesses. Buying or selling, eating or drinking, all are done by day and night on horseback, and they even bow forward over their beasts' narrow necks to enjoy a deep and dreamy sleep. When they need to debate some important matter, they conduct their conference in the same posture. They are not subject to the authority of any king, but break through any obstacle in their path under the improvised command of their chief men. They sometimes fight by challenging their foes to single combat, but when they join battle, they advance in packs, uttering their various war cries. Being lightly equipped and very sudden in their movements, they can deliberately scatter and gallop about at random, inflicting tremendous slaughter. Their extreme nimbleness enables them to force a rampart or pillage an enemy's camp before one catches sight of them. What makes them the most formidable of all warriors is that they shoot from a distance arrows tipped with sharp splinters of bone instead of the usual heads. These are joined to the shafts with wonderful skill. At close quarters they fight without regard for their lives, and while their opponents are guarding against sword thrusts, they catch their limbs in lassos of twisted cloth, which make it impossible for them to ride or walk. None of them ploughs or ever touches a plough handle. They have no fixed abode, no home, or law, or settled manner of life, but wander like refugees with the wagons in which they live. In these their wives weave their filthy clothing, mate with their husbands, give birth to their children, and rear them to the age of puberty. No one, if asked, can tell where he comes from, having been conceived in one place, born somewhere else, and reared even further off. You cannot make a truce with them, because they are quite unreliable, and easily swayed by any breath of rumour which promises an advantage. Like unreasoning beasts, they are entirely at the mercy of the maddest impulses. They are totally ignorant of the distinction between right and wrong. Their speech is shifty and obscure, and they are under no restraint from religion or superstition. Their greed for gold is prodigious, and they are so fickle and prone to anger that often in a single day they will quarrel with their allies without any provocation, and then make it up again, without anyone attempting to reconcile them. This wild race, moving without encumbrances and consumed by a savage passion to pillage the property of others, advanced robbing and slaughtering over the lands of their neighbours until they reached the Alans. The Alans are the ancient Massagetae, and at this point it is relevant to discuss their origin and situation. This is a problem that has perplexed geographers who have, however, after much discussion, found a reliable solution. The Danube, swollen by the waters of a number of tributaries, flows past the territory of the Sarmatians, which extends as far as the River Don, the boundary between Europe and Asia. Beyond this, the Alans inhabit the immense deserts of Scythia, deriving their name from the mountains. By repeated victories they gradually wore down the people next to them, and like the Persians, incorporated them into a single nation bearing their own name. Of these, the Nervi occupy the interior of the country, near the high peaks, whose steep sides are frozen hard and swept by north winds. Next to them are the savage tribes of the Vedini and Goloni, who flay the skin from their dead enemies and make coverings of it for themselves and their charges. On the borders of the Goloni are the Agathyresi, who tattoo their bodies and colour their hair with a blue dye. The common people display only small spots widely spaced, but in the nobles they are larger and closer together. Beyond them we are told roam the Melancolini and the Anthropophagi, who live on human flesh. On account of this abominable habit, all their neighbours have given them a wide berth and removed to distant regions. In consequence, the entire northeastern tract as far as China has remained uninhabited. In another direction, near the country of the Amazons, the Alans approach the east and form populous and widespread communities. These stretch into Asia, and I have been told that they reach as far as the Ganges, the river which intersects India and empties into the Southern Sea. Thus, the Alans, whose various tribes there is no point in enumerating, extend over both parts of the earth, Europe and Asia. But although they are widely separated and wander in their nomadic way over immense areas, they have in the course of time come to be known by one name, and are all compendiously called Alans, because their character, their wild way of life, and their weapons are the same everywhere. They have no huts and make no use of the plough, but live upon meat and plenty of milk. They use wagons covered with a curved canopy of bark, and move in these over the endless desert. When they come to a grassy place, they arrange their carts in a circle and feed like wild animals. Then, having exhausted the forage available, they again settle what one might call their mobile towns upon their vehicles and move on. In these wagons the males couple with the women, and their children are born and reared. In fact, these wagons are their permanent dwellings, and wherever they go, they look upon them as their ancestral home. They drive their cattle before them and pasture them with their flocks, and they pay particular attention to the breeding of horses. The plains there are always green, and there are occasional patches of fruit trees, so that wherever they go, they never lack food and fodder. This is because the soil is damp, and there are numerous rivers. Those whose age or sex makes them unfit to fight stay by the wagons and occupy themselves in light work, but the young men, who are inured to riding from earliest boyhood, think it beneath their dignity to walk, and are all trained in a variety of ways to be skilful warriors. This is why the Persians too, who are of Scythian origin, are such expert fighters. Almost all Alans are tall and handsome, with yellowish hair and frighteningly fierce eyes. They are active and nimble in their use of arms, and in every way are a match for the Huns, but are less savage in their habits and way of life. Their raiding and hunting expeditions take them as far as the Sea of Azov and the Crimea, and also to Armenia and Media. They take as much delight in the dangers of war as quiet and peaceful folk in ease and leisure. They regard it as the height of good fortune to lose one's life in battle. Those who grow old and die a natural death are bitterly reviled as degenerate cowards. Their proudest boast is to have killed a man, no matter whom, and their most coveted trophy is to use the flayed skins of their decapitated foes as trappings for their horses. No temples or shrines are to be found amongst them, not so much as a hut thatched with straw, but their savage custom is to stick a naked sword in the earth and worship it as the god of war, the presiding deity of the religion over which they range. They have a wonderful way of foretelling the future. They collect straight twigs of osier, and at an appointed time sort them out, uttering a magic formula, and in this way they obtain clear knowledge of what is to come. They are all free from birth, and slavery is unknown among them. To this day they choose as their leaders men who have proved their worth by long experience in war. Now I must return to what remains of my main theme. The Huns and Alans expel the Goths from their homes. The Huns, overrunning the territory of those Alans who border on the Gathungi and are commonly called the Donallans, killed and stripped many of them, and made a pact of friendship with the survivors. This success emboldened them to make a sudden inroad on the rich and extensive realm of Emmenric, a warlike king, whose many heroic exploits had made him a terror in his neighbourhood. Emmenric was hard hit by the violence of this unexpected storm. For some time he endeavoured to stand his ground, but exaggerated reports circulated of the dreadful fate which awaited him, and he found release from his fears by taking his own life. He was succeeded as king by Withimir, who resisted the Alans for a time, relying on the help of other Huns, whom he had hired to support him. But after many defeats he was overwhelmed by superior force and lost his life in battle. The guardianship of his young son Videric was undertaken by Elathius and Sathrax, experienced commanders of proven courage, but their plans were frustrated by circumstance, and they had to abandon any hope of successful resistance, so they prudently withdrew to the line of the river Dniester, which waters the wide plains between the Danube and the Dnieper. Athanaric, the chief of the Frevungi, against whom, as I have already said, Valens had recently taken the field, to punish him for sending help to Procopius, heard of these unexpected events, and attempted to maintain his ground, being resolved to put forth all his strength, if he should be attacked like the rest. Accordingly, he took up his position in a good spot near the banks of the Dniester, but some distance from the defensive works of the Greuthungi, and sent Munderic, who later commanded on the Arabian frontier, together with Lagarimon, and some other notables 20 miles ahead to watch for the approach of the enemy, while he himself marshalled his army undisturbed. But things turned out very differently from what he had expected. The Huns, who are good guessers, suspected that there was a large force further off, so they paid no attention to the troops they had seen, who had lain down to rest as if they had no enemy near them. Then the Huns forded the river by moonlight and took what was undoubtedly the best course. They forestalled the possibility of any warning reaching the enemy by making a rapid assault on Athanaric himself, and before he could recover from the surprise of their first onset, drove him with some losses on their own part to take refuge in rugged mountainous country. This new situation and the fear that there was worse to follow constrained him to erect a high rampart extending from the Pruth to the Danube, and skirting the territory of the Taifali. He believed that this hastily but carefully constructed barrier would ensure his security, but while he was pushing on this important work, he was hard-pressed by the rapid advance of the Huns, who would have overwhelmed him if the weight of booty they were carrying had not forced them to desist. A report, however, now spread wildly among the other Gothic tribes that a hitherto unknown race of men had appeared from some remote corner of the earth, uprooting and destroying everything in its path, like a whirlwind descending from high mountains. Weakened by lack of the necessities of life, the greater part of the people abandoned Athanaric, and looked for a dwelling far from all knowledge of the barbarians. After much debate on where to settle, they fixed upon Thrace as the most eligible refuge for 2 reasons. First, because of its fertility, and second, because it is separated by the broad stream of the Danube from the regions exposed to the thunderbolts of the alien Mars. This decision met with unanimous support. The Goths crossed the Danube. So led by Alavivius, the Frevungi spread themselves over the bank of the Danube and sent agents to Valens, humbly begging to be admitted to his domains, and promising that they would live quietly and supply him with auxiliaries if the need arose. While this was going on outside our frontiers, terrifying rumours got about of a new and unusually violent commotion among the peoples of the north. Men heard that over the whole area extending from the Marcomanni and Quadi to the Black Sea, a savage horde of remote tribes, driven from their homes by unexpected pressure, were roaming with their families in the Danube region. Our people paid little attention to this at first, because news of wars in these parts generally reaches distant hearers only when they are already over, or at least quiescent. Gradually, however, the story gained credence, and it was confirmed by the arrival of the foreign agents, begging and praying that the host of refugees might be allowed to cross to our side of the river. Even so, the affair seemed a matter for rejoicing rather than dread, and the practised flatterers in the emperor's entourage extolled in extravagant terms the good fortune which unexpectedly presented him with a large body of recruits drawn from the ends of the earth. Combined with his own troops, they would give him an invincible army, and there was the further advantage that a vast amount of gold would accrue to the treasury by way of the levy paid each year by the provinces in lieu of troops. With these high hopes, various officials were sent to transport this wild host, and the greatest care was taken to ensure that even if he were suffering from mortal illness, none of those destined to overthrow the Roman Empire should be left behind. Once the emperor's permission to cross the Danube and settle in parts of Thrace had been granted, the work of transportation went on day and night. The Goths embarked by troops on boats and rafts and canoes made from hollowed tree trunks. The crowd was such that, though the river is the most dangerous in the world and was then swollen by frequent rains, a large number tried to swim and were drowned in their struggle against the force of the stream. Thus the tumultuous eagerness of those who urged on these proceedings led to the destruction of the Roman world. One thing at least is clear and certain. The unlucky officials responsible for the operation tried several times to calculate the number of the barbarians, but had to give up the attempt as hopeless. In the words of our greatest poet, to try to find their number is in vain, as numbering the wind-swept Libyan sands. This event may well give a new lease of life to the old stories about the Persian invasion of Greece. These include a description of the bridges over the Hellespont, the cutting of an artificial channel for the sea through the isthmus of Athos, and the numbering of the army by companies at Dariscus, and have all been dismissed as fables by the unanimous verdict of posterity. The credibility of the old account is now strengthened by this fresh instance of a countless swarm of peoples pouring over the provinces, spreading themselves over the wide plains, and occupying every region and every mountain range. The first to be received were the Fritigan and Alvivius, who by the emperor's orders were given food for their immediate needs and land to cultivate. The critical situation resulting from the opening of our frontier and the eruption of armed men from the barbarian lands like lava from Etna called for generals of the highest distinction. But by some unfavourable dispensation of Providence, men of flawed character were collected and put in command. At their head were Lupicinus and Maximus, the one commander in Thrace and the other a disastrous general, both equally reckless. Their sinister greed was the source of all our troubles, to say nothing of other crimes committed for the worst motives by these men or others with their permission against the hitherto innocent newcomers. One action must be recorded as so revolting and incredible that even judges prejudiced in their own favour could not pardon it. The barbarians, after crossing the river, were distressed by want of food, and these loathsome generals devised an abominable form of barter. They collected all the dogs that their insatiable greed could find, and exchanged each of them for a slave, and among these slaves were some sons of leading men. At the same period, Videric, king of the Graffungi, accompanied by his guardians, Elathius and Saphirax, together with Pharnobius, also approached the bank of the Danube and sent envoys in haste to beg the emperor to receive him with similar kindness. This request was rejected as not being in the public interest, and while they were in doubt what to do, Athanaric, fearing a like fate, took himself off. He recalled that he had treated Valens with some contempt at the time of the treaty, when he declared that he was bound by a solemn vow not to set foot on Roman soil, and forced the emperor in consequence to conclude negotiations in midstream. Fearing that this had caused a lasting grudge, he retired with all his men to Caucalanda, an inaccessible region of deep woods and high mountains, out of which he drove the Sarmatians. The Frevungi revolt from Valens and rout Lupicinus. It was now some time since the Frevungi had been allowed to cross the river, but they were still roaming about in its vicinity. Two difficulties beset them. In the first place, they were not supplied with the means of subsistence owing to the scandalous neglect of the generals, and in the second, they were deliberately kept there to maintain the shameful trade that I have mentioned. When they realised this, they grumbled that the only way out of their pressing troubles was to break their agreement, and Lupicinus, fearing a revolt, brought up troops to compel them to move on speedily. The Graffungi, seeing that our men were engaged elsewhere, and that the boats which patrolled the river to prevent their crossing had ceased to operate, took advantage of the opportunity to slip over on roughly made rafts, and pitched their camp a long way from Fritigern. The latter, however, whose native shrewdness served to protect him against any eventuality, found a way both to obey his orders and at the same time unite himself with these powerful kings. He advanced at a leisurely pace, and in due time reached Marcianople. Here another fearful event occurred, which fanned to a blaze the firebrands prepared by the Furies for the general ruin. Lupicinus invited Alavivus and Fritigern to dinner, but placed troops to keep the mass of the barbarians from the walls of the town. The latter made repeated requests to be allowed to enter to buy victuals, seeing that they were our subjects and allies, and finally quarrels broke out between the inhabitants and those excluded on such a scale that fighting became inevitable. The barbarians, roused to madness by seeing some of their kindred carried away by force, killed and stripped of their arms a large contingent of troops. News of this was secretly brought to Lupicinus, who, after a long time sitting at an extravagantly luxurious meal, followed by a noisy floor show, was muzzy and drooping with sleep. Guessing the outcome, he put to death the whole guard of honour which was waiting for the two princes outside his headquarters. The people surrounding the walls heard of this with great indignation. Uttering savage threats, they gradually thronged together to avenge their kings, whom they supposed to be prisoners. Fritigern, fearing that he might be kept as a hostage with the rest, was resourceful enough to cry out that there would be no avoiding a regular battle unless he were allowed to go with his companions to pacify his countrymen, whose riotous conduct he ascribed to the belief that their chiefs had been done to death under a show of hospitality. This request was granted. They emerged to be greeted with cheers of joy, and then took horse and hurried away to kindle the flames of war in various places. When common report, the spiteful nurse of rumour, noised abroad what had happened, the whole people of the Furvingi was on fire to fight. Amid fearful scenes which heralded the gravest danger, they raised their standards in their accustomed manner to the trumpet's dismal bray. Already bands of looters were rushing hither and thither, robbing and burning homesteads, and spreading devastation wherever they could find an opportunity. Lupicinus mustered his forces to meet them in tumultuous haste, and advanced with more temerity than discretion 9 miles from the city, where he halted ready to give battle. When they saw him, the barbarians hurled themselves recklessly on our line, dashing their shields upon the bodies of their opponents and running them through with spears and swords. In this furious and bloody assault our standards were snatched from us, and our tribunes and the greatest part of our men perished, all but their luckless commander, while others were fighting. His one aim was to get away, and he made for the city at a gallop. After this the enemy armed themselves with Roman weapons and roamed at large unresisted. Having reached this stage in my complex story, I earnestly beg my readers, should I have any, not to demand minute details or the exact number of the slain, which there was no way of discovering. A truthful and unvarnished summary of the main points will suffice. Scrupulous honesty is the duty of every writer of history. Those who are ignorant of ancient times say that this was the darkest disaster which ever fell upon the state, but they are led astray by the horror they feel at this latest catastrophe. A review of earlier or even quite recent history will show that such melancholy events have often happened. The Teutones and Cimbri came from the furthest shores of ocean and flooded over Italy, but after inflicting enormous losses on the Roman state, they were finally overcome by our great generals and destroyed root and branch, learning from a fight to the death what can be achieved in war by a combination of might and good judgment. Again, in the reign of Marcus, a number of discordant peoples combined in mad fury, and after prodigious commotion and the infliction of great suffering on the cities they captured and sacked, seemed likely to leave but a small part of our territory intact. But after these calamitous losses the situation was restored. This was because our old sober morality had not yet been undermined by the temptations of a laxer and more effeminate way of life. There was no craving for ostentatious banquets and ill-gotten gains. High and low alike were of one mind, and eager to meet a glorious death for their country, as if it were a peaceful and quiet heaven. Again, hordes of Scythian tribes burst the barrier of the Bosphorus and the Sea of Marmara in 2,000 ships and inflicted bitter defeats on us by land and sea. But they lost the greater part of their number and had to retreat. The 2 emperors Decius, father and son, fell fighting against the barbarians. The cities of Pamphylia were besieged, many islands laid waste, and the whole of Macedonia set on fire. For a long time their host lay encamped around Thessalonica and Cyzicus. Anchialus was taken, and also Nicopolis, which had been founded by the Emperor Trajan as a memorial of his victory over the Dacians. After many cruel calamities on both sides, Philippopolis was destroyed, and if the records are to be trusted, 100,000 people were slaughtered within its walls. Foreign foes ranged at will over Epirus, Thessaly, and the whole of Greece. But when the celebrated General Claudius became emperor, and after his noble death was succeeded by Aurelian, an active commander and a ruthless revenger of injuries, the enemy were driven back and kept quiet for very many years, except that occasionally bands of robbers raided the parts nearest to them, and brought destruction upon themselves. But I must now pursue the topic from which I digressed. Ceridas and Coelius rebel. The news of these events was spread by a series of messengers, but the Gothic chieftains Ceridas and Coelius, who had been admitted into our territory with their followers much earlier and assigned to Adrianople for winter quarters, thought their own safety more important than anything else, and refused to let themselves be disturbed by what had happened. Suddenly, however, a letter came from the emperor, ordering them to remove to the provinces of Hellespont. They respectfully asked for journey money, food, and a postponement of 2 days, but this request was very ill received by the chief magistrate of the city, who bore them a grudge for damage done to his property in the suburbs. Collecting the dregs of the populace along with the workers in the arsenal, who are there very numerous, he put arms in their hands, ordered the trumpets to sound, and threatened the Goths with the most dire consequences if they did not depart at once in accordance with the emperor's command. The Goths, bewildered by this unexpected ill-treatment and alarmed by the prospect of an attack by the citizens, more impromptu than deliberate, stood stock still, till at last a storm of curses and abuse, accompanied by an occasional missile, drove them into open revolt. They killed a large number who had been misled by their own rashness into launching an assault, and compelled the rest to retire wounded in all sorts of ways. Then, equipping themselves with Roman arms stripped from the dead, they put themselves under the orders of Ketone-Kun, whom they saw in the neighbourhood, blockaded the city and threatened it with the horrors of a siege. They were, however, in difficulties themselves. Their attacks on the city were disorderly and uncoordinated. They lost some men of outstanding valour whom they were unable to avenge, and arrows and slingstones accounted for many of them. Ketone-Kun, realizing that it was pointless for men without experience of siege works to fight at such a disadvantage, suggested that the siege should be abandoned and sufficient force left behind to contain the enemy. He had no quarrel, he said, with stone walls, and he advised them to attack and pillage in perfect safety rich and fruitful regions which were still unguarded. They approved of this plan, in which they knew that they would have the king's active support, and advanced cautiously in small parties over the whole of Thrace. Some of their prisoners, or others who had surrendered voluntarily, pointed out to them rich districts, particularly those whose food was said to be abundant. Their natural confidence was much increased by the fact that every day their numbers were augmented by a host of their own people who had been sold into slavery at an earlier date, together with many who, at the first crossing of the river, had been exchanged for a little thin wine or mouldy bread by men half dead from starvation. They were joined too in no small numbers by expert prospectors for gold, who were unable to bear the heavy burden of taxation. These were warmly welcomed and proved to be of great service as they traversed this strange country by directing them to concealed stores of grain and hidden corners where people had taken refuge. Under their guidance, only the most inaccessible and out-of-the-way places were left untouched. Everything was consumed in an orgy of killing and burning that paid no regard to age or sex. Infants were snatched from the very breasts and put to death. Mothers ravished, and married women widowed by seeing their husbands killed before their eyes. Boys of tender years were dragged away over the corpses of their parents. Many older men, who had lost their possessions and their lovely wives, were marched into exile with their arms tied behind them, crying out that they had lived too long, and weeping over the ashes of the homes of their fathers. An inconclusive battle with the Goths. The Emperor Valens heard with great sorrow of this news from Thrace, which multiplied his anxieties. The threatening state of affairs required some agreement about Armenia, and he at once sent Victor, the master of horse, to Persia to arrange this. He decided to leave Antioch himself and wait for a time at Constantinople, sending on in advance Profuturus and Trajan, both men of high ambition but poor generals. In the region where they had to operate, the right policy was to wear down the enemy piecemeal by guerrilla warfare, but this pair took the untimely and dangerous course of engaging the barbarians, who were still raging like madmen, with their legions from Armenia. These had often shown to advantage in battle, but they were no match for the huge numbers which had spread themselves over the high mountains as well as the plains. These units, which had never experienced what can be achieved by a combination of despair and wild fury, drove the enemy beyond the rugged Balkan range and forced them into its steep defiles, a barren wilderness from which it was hoped that they would be unable to find a way out, and so ultimately perish from hunger. Meanwhile, our men were to wait for the arrival of the General Frigoridus, who was on his way with reinforcements drawn from the Pannonian and Transalpine troops. Gratian, in response to an appeal from Valens, had ordered him to take the field and succour the forces of his uncle, which were facing utter destruction. Frigoridus was followed by Ricimer, commander of the household troops, who also at Gratian's orders moved from Gaul and hurried towards Thrace. The regiments that he brought with him were regiments only in name. Most of their numbers had deserted at the insistence, it was alleged, of Merobordes, who feared that if Gaul was stripped of its defences it would be wide open to raids from across the Rhine. Since, however, Frigoridus was disabled by gout, or, as his detractors asserted, pretended to be so to avoid the heat of battle, Ricimer, by common consent, took command of the whole force and joined Profuturus and Trajan, who were encamped near the town of Silices. Not far away was a countless horde of barbarians who had drawn up their numerous wagons in a circle, inside which they were taking their ease and enjoying their rich plunder as comfortably as if they were protected by city walls. Hoping that things would take a turn for the better and that the opportunity for a glorious feat of arms would present itself, the Roman generals watched carefully for any moves by the Goths. The plan was that, if they were to shift their camp, as they very often did, the Romans would fall on their rear, run many of them through, and carry off a large part of their spoils. The enemy saw through this design, or heard of it from deserters, who kept them informed of everything. So they remained stationary for a long time, but in the end, fear of the opposing army and the expectation that it would receive reinforcements drove them to summon by their tribal call the raiding parties scattered in the vicinity. These obeyed the orders of their chiefs and returned like lightning to what they called their wagon fort, where their presence stimulated their countrymen to great daring. After that, neither side had any rest except for brief periods of truce. Once those whom it had been necessary to detach had returned, the whole host was crowded together inside its ring fence in noisy commotions and fierce excitement, eager to encounter any danger and meeting with no discouragement on the part of its leaders. It was now, however, late in the day, and nightfall compelled them reluctantly and sullenly to rest. So they took some food at their leisure, but remained awake. When they learned what was going on, the Romans on their part were equally sleepless. The enemy and their crazy leaders were as dangerous as so many wild beasts. But though our inferior numbers made the outcome doubtful, our men awaited it intrepidly, trusting for success in the greater justice of their cause. Day had hardly dawned when the trumpets on both sides gave the signal for battle. The barbarians, after taking their customary oath to stand by one another, attempted to reach some hilly ground from which they could rush down as if on wheels and carry all before them by the impetus of their attack. In view of this, our men hurried to their stations and stood fast. No one strayed about or left the ranks to make a sally. When both sides had advanced cautiously and halted, the opposing warriors glared at each other with mutual ferocity. The Romans raised their morale by striking up their battle cry. This begins on a low note and swells to a loud roar and goes by the native name of Berytus. But the barbarians roared out rude chants in praise of their forefathers, and while this discordant clamour in diverse tongues was going on, skirmishes began. After an exchange of javelins and other missiles at long range, the opposing sides clashed and fought foot on foot, with their shields locked in tortoise formation. The barbarians, with their usual nimbleness and alacrity, hurled at our men huge clubs hardened by the fire, plunged their daggers in the breasts of those who put up a stout resistance, and broke through our left wing. This gave way, but a strong body of reserves made a fierce counter-attack from close by and rescued our men from the very jaws of death. As the fighting grew hotter, there was great slaughter. All the most active rushed into the thick of the fight and met their deaths either by the hail of missiles or by the sword. The fugitives on either side were pursued by cavalry who hacked at their heads and backs with all their strength, while at the same time men on foot hamstrung those who had got away but were checked by fright. The whole field was strewn with corpses, among whom were some only half dead who still nursed a futile hope of survival. A number had fallen by slingshot or had been transfixed by shafts tipped with metal. In some cases the heads had been split in two by a sword stroke through the crown and forehead, and hung down on both shoulders, a most gruesome sight. Stubborn though the conflict was, neither side gave way to exhaustion, and neither gained the upper hand. The fight was kept up without any abatement or resolution on either part as long as men's strength and spirit held out, but at last the day gave place to evening, which put an end to the murderous struggle. Both sides withdrew in disorder as best they could, and the survivors returned in gloom to their camps. Some of the dead, who were men of note, received such burial as the time and place allowed. The bodies of the rest were devoured by birds of prey, which were accustomed to feast on corpses at that period. The proof of this is that the battlefield is still white with bones. It is certain that the Romans, who were far fewer, suffered great losses in this fight against superior numbers, but in spite of this they inflicted severe distress on the barbarian host. The Goths break out and devastate Thrace. After the lamentable termination of this battle, our troops returned to the neighbouring city of Marcellinus. The Goths crowded of their own will within their narrow circuit of their wagons, and did not dare to emerge or show themselves for 7 days. This gave our forces the opportunity to build high barriers to confine the other huge hordes of barbarians in the defiles of the Balkan range, hoping, of course, that this destructive enemy host, penned between the Danube and the wilderness and unable to find a way out, would perish from lack of food, all the necessities of life having been removed to the fortified towns, none of which the barbarians even then attempted to besiege owing to their total ignorance of operations of this kind. After this, Ricimer returned to Gaul to fetch fresh troops for the greater battles which were expected. All this took place towards the beginning of autumn, when Gratian, with Merabordes for his colleague, was consul for the 4th time. Meanwhile, Valens, on receiving these sad tidings of war and devastation, put Saturninus in temporary command of the cavalry and sent him to the aid of Trajan and Profuturus. At the same time, the barbarians, having consumed everything edible in the regions of Scythia and Moesia, were compelled by hunger as much as their native ferocity to make frantic efforts to break out. After several attempts had been frustrated by the energy of our troops, who put up a stout resistance on the rugged terrain, the enemy were driven by sheer necessity to seek the alliance of some of the Huns and Alans by dangling before them the prospect of immense booty. News of this caused Saturninus, who by this time had arrived and was arranging a system of outposts and pickets, gradually to concentrate his forces and prepare to withdraw. He had good reason to do so. There was a danger that the barbarian host might suddenly burst through like a river in spite, and sweep away without difficulty all who were keeping a close watch on the points of danger. Once the passes were left open by the timely withdrawal of our men, the enemy escaped from the confinement in a disorderly rush, as each man found his way clear and set about creating havoc. They spread devastation over the whole breadth of Thrace, from the banks of the Danube to the range of Rhodope, and the strait which separates the two great seas. Everything was involved in a foul orgy of rapine and slaughter, bloodshed and fire, and frightful atrocities were inflicted on the bodies of free men. Sights as fearful to relate as to behold met men's sorrowing eyes, women driven along under the lash distraught with fear and carrying the burden of infants yet unborn, on which horrors had fallen even before they had come to the light of day, small children too clinging to their mothers. One could hear the cries of boys and girls of high birth whose hands were tied by their cruel captors, and see grown maidens and chaste wives led along with drooping heads, bewailing their fate, longing to escape violation by any death, however agonizing. Here a man of good birth, who not long before had been rich and free, was being dragged like a wild beast, railing at the cruelty and blindness of fortune, which in a moment had stripped him of his wealth and family, driven him from his home, which he saw reduced to dust and ashes, and placed him at the mercy of a brutal conqueror, either to be torn limb from limb, or to endure the blows and tortures of slavery. The barbarians poured over the wide extent of Thrace like wild animals escaping from their cage, and made for the town of Dibaltum, where they found Barzimus, tribune of the Scutari and a veteran commander. They fell upon him as he was pitching his camp with his own men and the Cornuti and some other infantry units. Finding himself in imminent danger of destruction, he ordered the trumpets to sound, strengthened his flanks, and charged at the head of his men in full battle order. His brave resistance would have brought him off undefeated, had he not been surrounded by a strong force of cavalry when he was breathless from exhaustion. So he fell after causing the barbarians serious casualties, whose numbers were concealed by the size of their forces. Frigoridus defeats the Goths and Typhali. After this exploit, the Goths were in doubt about their next move, but decided to seek out and destroy Frigoridus, who was a formidable obstacle in their path. After a short pause for sleep and something better than their usual food, they set out to hunt him down like a wild beast on the trail. They had heard that he had returned to Thrace at Gratian's orders, and fortified a position near Beroia, where he was waiting to see how things would develop. But while they were hurrying to execute their plan, Frigoridus, a general who knew how to conserve as well as how to employ his forces, either guessed what they had in mind or received clear information from his scouts, and returned over high mountains and through thick forests to Illyricum, elated by a great piece of good fortune which unexpectedly befell him on the way. As he was slowly advancing with his men in close order, he came upon the Gothic chief Farnobius, who was roaming at large with his bands of brigands, and had with him the Typhali, who had recently joined him. I hardly like to mention that the latter had taken advantage of our men having scattered in fear of these unknown tribes to cross the river and ravage the regions we had left defenceless. When the cautious Frigoridus suddenly caught sight of them, he got ready for a hand-to-hand fight, and launched an attack upon the marauders of both peoples, before they could do more than utter fierce threats. He could have destroyed them to a man, so that no one would have been left to tell the tale. But when so many had fallen, including Farnobius, who had been a formidable troublemaker, he yielded to the survivors' urgent entreaties for mercy, and banished those whose lives he had spared to the Italian towns of Modena, Reggio, and Parma to work on the land. I have been told that the people of the Taifali are so sunk in gross sensuality that among them boys couple with men in a union of unnatural lust, and waste the flower of their youth in the polluted embraces of their lovers. But if a young man catches a boar single-handed or kills a huge bear, he is exempt thereafter from the contamination of this lewd intercourse. Gratian's generals defeat the Lentienses. Such was the storm of destruction which swept over Thrace as autumn turned to winter, but the frenzy that prevailed at that time spread abroad and extended also to distant regions, as if the whole world were at the mercy of the Furies. The Lentienses, an Alemannic tribe on the border of Rhaetia, made treacherous raids on our frontier in violation of a long-standing agreement. The origin of this disastrous event was as follows. One of that tribe who was serving as a member of the Imperial Guard returned home on personal business, and being a chatterbox, told those who asked him what was happening at court, that Gratian had been sent for by his uncle Valens and would soon march to the east, to double the forces available to repel the people on our frontiers who had conspired to destroy the Roman state. This information was greedily swallowed up by the Lentinenses, who saw that they were themselves in a similar position relative to us. With their usual speed and impulsiveness, they formed themselves into raiding parties and in February crossed the Rhine upon the ice. The Celts, however, who were encamped nearby with the Petulantes, were strong enough to inflict a severe defeat upon them, though not without loss to themselves. But although the Germans were forced to withdraw, the knowledge that most of the army had gone ahead to Illyricum to await the Emperor heightened their war fever, and they conceived the idea of a great exploit. Gathering together the inhabitants of all the districts, they burst into our territory in a mood of sublime confidence. Their armed men numbered 40,000, though some, to magnify the triumph of the Emperor, put them at 70,000. This news caused Gratian great alarm. He recalled the units which he had sent ahead into Pannonia, mobilized the others, which he had wisely retained in Gaul, and put the business in the hands of a brave but prudent general called Ammianus, joining, however, with him in the command Malobordes, the count of the household troops and king of the Franks, who was always spoiling for a fight. So while Ammianus kept in mind the fickleness of fortune and counselled caution, Malobordes, who could brook no delay, was given, by his habitual consuming eagerness for battle, into attacking the enemy. A terrific din arose on the other side, the trumpet sounded, and battle was joined at Argentaria. Both sides suffered casualties from arrows and javelins, but when the fighting was at its hottest, our men, realizing that the enemy's numbers were inexhaustible, avoided open combat by dispersing as best they could over broken country covered with trees. Then they stood their ground firmly, and the imposing spectacle of their gleaming arms seen in the distance inspired the barbarians with fear that the Emperor was approaching. They suddenly turned tail, and in spite of sporadic attempts to fight to the last, were so thoroughly cut to pieces that it was estimated that out of the number I mentioned, not more than 5,000 escaped under cover of the woods. Among a number of other bold and brave men, they lost their king, Priarius, the author of this disastrous war. Gratian, who was already on his way to the east, was so elated by this success that he made a left turn and crossed the Rhine unobserved, in the confident expectation that, if his luck held, he would be able utterly to destroy this treacherous and turbulent people. A series of messengers brought news of this to the Lentinenses, who were already almost annihilated by the losses their people had suffered. Stunned by the sudden approach of the Emperor, they were at their wits' end. Not a moment's respite was to be had to organise resistance or concert a plan, so they made a rush for some heights, and were defended by impassable crags. Here they took up their position on the encircling cliffs and prepared to fight to the last in defence of their possessions and families, which they had brought with them. In the face of this difficulty, 500 veterans were picked from each legion to force a barrier as strong as a city wall. Their resolve was strengthened by seeing the Emperor playing an active part among the foremost, and they set about scaling the cliffs as if 100 animals awaited easy capture when they reached the top. The fight began before midday and was still going on at nightfall. Both sides suffered heavy losses. Our men slew and were slain in considerable number, and the gilded and brightly coloured armour of the Imperial Guard was shattered by a hail of heavy missiles. After a long conference with his senior officers, Gratian decided that it was dangerous and pointless to persist with ill-timed obstinacy against these rugged and towering heights. Many different views were naturally put forward, but the final decision was to give our men a respite and starve the barbarians out by a blockade in view of the unfavourable nature of the terrain. But the Germans still held out as doggedly as ever, and were enabled by their local knowledge to retreat to other hills higher than those they had previously occupied. So the Emperor turned his army in that direction with unabated courage, and began to look for paths leading to the heights. Then the Lentinenses, realising that he was inflexibly resolved not to relax his grip on their throats, humbly begged for terms and surrendered. As one of the conditions, their able-bodied young men were enrolled among our recruits, and the rest were allowed to return home unharmed. This timely and profitable victory, which crippled the western tribes, was, by the blessing of heaven, achieved by Gratian in a display of unbelievable energy at a time when he was marching at top speed in another direction. He was a young man of remarkable talent, eloquent, controlled, warlike and merciful, and seemed likely to rival the best of his predecessors when the down of youth was still spreading over his cheeks. But he had an innate tendency to play the fool which his intimates made no attempt to check, and this seduced him into the frivolous pursuits of the Emperor Commodus, although he was never bloodthirsty. Commodus was in the habit of dispatching with javelins a host of wild animals before the eyes of the populace, and used a variety of weapons to slaughter without the need for a second blow 100 lions let loose together in the amphitheatre, an exploit which gave him prodigious delight. Similarly, Gratian amused himself by shooting at beasts of prey enclosed in what are called game preserves, and neglected many matters of serious importance. This was at a time when even Mark Antony, had he been emperor, would hardly have been able to remedy the lamentable state of public affairs without colleagues like himself and a most prudent policy. After taking such steps as the situation in Gaul required, and punishing the treacherous targeteer who had revealed to the barbarians that the enemy was on his way to Illyricum, Gratian made forced marches by way of the forts at Felix Arbor and Lavracium to bring help to the parts where it was most needed. At the same moment, Frigoridus, who among other useful contributions to the general welfare, was hurrying to fortify the pass of Saki, so as to prevent bodies of light-armed marauders spreading at will over the northern provinces like rivers in spate, was superseded by one Count Maurus, whose bold exterior masked a corrupt nature, and who was in every respect shifty and unreliable. This was the man who, while serving in the bodyguard, had, as I related earlier, the presumption as well as the wit to take the chain from his own neck and offer it to the Caesar Julian when the latter was in doubt what to use as a diadem. So at the very moment when we were reeling under disasters, a cautious and careful general was dismissed, who, even if he had been long retired, ought to have been recalled to duty in such a grave crisis. Victory of Sebastian at Boeotia. At about the same time Valens accomplished the long march from Antioch and reached Constantinople, where his stay, which lasted very few days, was disturbed by a minor outbreak of popular discontent. Sebastian, a notably wide-awake general who had recently been sent from Italy at Valens' request, was put in command of the infantry in succession to Trajan. Valens himself moved to the imperial estate of Melanthius and tried to put the troops in good humour by pay rations and much flattering talk. He then gave orders to march to a fort called Nike, where he heard from scouts that the barbarians had returned laden with booty from the region of Rhodope to the neighbourhood of Adrianople, but on learning that the emperor was on the move with a large force, were now hurrying to join their countrymen in a fortified camp near Beroea and Nicopolis. This gave an opening which was not to be lost. 300 men were picked from each unit, and Sebastian was directed to march with his force and perform his promise to do the state some service. He advanced at speed until he was seen near Adrianople, where the gates were tight shut, and he was forbidden to come near. Its garrison were afraid that he might have been captured and suborned by the enemy, and that this would have fatal consequences for the city, such as occurred when a commander was caught in a trap by the troops of Magnentius and used by them to open the passes of the Julian Alps. In the end, however, Sebastian was recognised and admitted into the city. He gave his men such food and rest as he could, and the next day sallied out again secretly and in haste. Towards evening he suddenly caught sight of some Gothic raiding parties near the river Maritza. He concealed himself for a while behind dikes and bushes, and then crept forward on tiptoe under the cover of night to attack them in their sleep. His success was so complete that all perished except for a few who saved themselves by speed of foot. An immense quantity of booty was retrieved, more than the city and the wide area about it could hold. Fritigern was stung by this disaster, fearing that this general, of whose reputation for success he was well aware, might surprise and destroy his separated parties while they were scattered at large and intent on pillage. He recalled them all to the vicinity of Kabil and then quickly evacuated the area, intending to keep his people in open country where they could not be surprised or suffer from lack of food. During these events in Thrace, Gratian, who had informed his uncle by letter of his hard-won victory over the Alemanni, sent on his baggage train overland, while he himself with a light-armed force descended the Danube to Bononia and entered Sirmium. After 4 days' stay he went on by water to the camp of Mars, though he was suffering from an intermittent fever. In that region he unexpectedly attacked some Alans and lost a few of his men. During these events in Thrace, Gratian, who had informed his uncle by letter of his hard-won victory over the Alemanni, sent on his baggage train overland, while he himself with a light-armed force descended the Danube to Bononia and entered Sirmium. After 4 days' stay he went on by water to the camp of Mars, though he was suffering from an intermittent fever. In that region he was unexpectedly attacked by some Alans, and lost a few of his men. Valens decides to fight without waiting for Gratian. 2 things vexed Valens at this period. First, the news that the Lentienses had been defeated, and second, the exaggerated accounts of his achievements sent from time to time by Sebastian. So he marched from Melanthius, eager to put himself on a level with his nephew, whose exploits irked him, by some glorious deed of his own. He had with him a force made up of various elements. It was active and by no means to be despised, seeing that it contained a large number of veterans and, among other officers of high rank, Trajan, recently the commander-in-chief, who had been recalled. Careful reconnaissance showed that the enemy intended to intercept our lines of supply with a strong force, but that threat was effectively met by dispatching a body of archers on foot together with a squadron of cavalry to secure the adjacent passes. During the next 3 days, the barbarians advanced slowly over difficult country and expected to be attacked, keeping 15 miles from the city and making for the post at night. Through some mistake, Valens was assured by his skirmishers that the part of the enemy's host that they had seen was only 10,000 strong, and this filled him with a rash craving to encounter them. Advancing in close formation, he took up a position near the outskirts of Adrianople and fortified it with a palisade and ditch. While he was impatiently waiting for Gratian, the count of the household troops, Ricimer, arrived. He had been sent ahead with a letter announcing that Gratian would soon be there himself. The letter contained an urgent plea that Valens would wait a short time until Gratian arrived to share the danger, and would not rashly commit himself to risk a decisive action single-handed. Valens called a council of war of various senior officers and canvassed their opinions. Some, under the influence of Sebastian, urged him to give battle at once, but the master of cavalry, Victor, who, though a Sarmatian, was a prudent and cautious man, found much support when he recommended that Valens should wait for his colleague in the empire, since the additional strength provided by the army of Gaul would make it easier to crush the fiery insolence of the barbarians. But the fatal obstinacy of the emperor and the flattery of some of his courtiers prevailed. They urged immediate action to prevent Gratian sharing in a victory which, in their opinion, was already as good as won. While the necessary preparations for battle were being made, a Christian presbyter, to use their own title, was sent by Fritigern with some other envoys of low rank to the emperor's camp. He was received with courtesy and presented a letter from his commander asking openly that he and his people, who had been driven from their homes by the migration of wild savages, should be allowed to settle in Thrace with all its corn and cattle, and promising perpetual peace if this request was granted. This same Christian, who was apparently a trusted confidant of Fritigern, gave Valens also a private letter from his master, who was an old hand at any kind of deception. In this he addressed Valens as his future friend and associate, and informed him that he would not be able to tame the fierce spirit of his countrymen and induce them to make terms favourable to the Romans, unless he could at once give them a sight of Valens' troops close at hand and ready for battle. The fear of the emperor's name would then damp their fatal passion for war. The envoys, however, did not inspire confidence and were sent away empty-handed. When dawn came, on the day marked in the calendar as the 9th of August, the army was put in rapid motion. All its impedimenta and baggage were left near the walls of Adrianople under an adequate guard, and the praetorian prefect and members of the constitutory remained inside the town with the treasure chests and the imperial insignia. After a march of 8 miles over rough country under a burning midday sun, our troops came within sight of the enemy's wagons, which, as our scouts had reported, were drawn up in regular circle. While the enemy in their usual way were raising a wild and doleful yell, the Roman generals marshalled their line of battle. The cavalry on the right wing were furthest advanced, and the greatest part of the infantry was some way to the rear. But the cavalry of our left wing were still straggling along the road, making what speed they could, but under serious difficulties. While they were deploying without as yet encountering any opposition, the barbarians, alarmed by the dreadful din of clattering arms and the ominous beating of shields, and bearing in mind that part of their force under Elanthius and Sathorax had not yet come up, though it had been summoned, again sent envoys to ask for peace. The emperor was not prepared to treat with people of such low rank and demanded that persons of suitable standing should be sent to him to make a firm agreement, but the enemy deliberately wasted time so that their own cavalry, which they expected at any moment might have a chance to get back while this sham armistice lasted, and also to ensure that our men, who were already exhausted by the summer sun, should be parched with thirst. With this in view, they first fired the countryside over a wide area, feeding the flames with wood and other dry material. A further fatal circumstance was that both men and beasts were tormented by severe hunger. In the meantime, Fritigern, who had great foresight and dreaded the uncertainties of battle, on his own responsibility sent a private soldier as herald to suggest that if some picked person of high rank were at once sent as hostage, he would come himself without fear to conduct the necessary negotiations. This proposal from so formidable a commander met with warm approval, and the tribune Equitus, a kinsman of Valens and marshal of the court, was unanimously chosen to go at once as security. When he objected, on the grounds that he had escaped as a prisoner of war from Daibaltum, and therefore feared the irrational anger of the Goths, Ricimer offered to take his place, and gladly undertook what he regarded as a glorious and heroic mission. He was on his way to the enemy's rampart, with evidence of his rank and birth, when the archers and Scutari, commanded by Cassio and the Iberian Baccharis, impulsively launched a hot attack and enraged the enemy. Their retreat was as cowardly as their advance had been rash, a most inauspicious start to the battle. This untimely proceeding not only thwarted the errand of Ricimer, who was forbidden to go at all, but also brought on an attack by the Gothic cavalry under Elathius and Saphrax, who had now arrived, supported by a party of Alans. They shot forward like a bolt from on high, and routed with great slaughter all that they could come to grips with in their wild career. Gothic victory and the death of Valens. Amid the clashing of arms and weapons on every side, while Bellona, raging with more than her usual fury, was sounding the death knell of the Roman cause, our retreating troops rallied with shouts of mutual encouragement. But as the fighting spread like fire, and numbers of them were transfixed by arrows and whirling javelins, they lost heart. Then the opposing lines came into collision like ships of war, and pushed each other to and fro, heaving under the reciprocal motion like the waves of the sea. Our left wing penetrated as far as the very wagons, and would have gone further if it had received any support, but it was abandoned by the rest of the cavalry, and under pressure of numbers gave way and collapsed like a broken dike. This left the infantry unprotected, and so closely huddled together that a man could hardly wield his sword or draw back his arm once he had stretched it out. Dust rose in such clouds as to hide the sky, which rang with frightful shouts. In consequence, it was impossible to see the enemy's missiles in flight and dodge them. All found their mark and dealt death on every side. The barbarians poured on in huge columns, trampling down horse and man alike, and crushing our ranks so as to make an orderly retreat impossible. Our men were too close packed to have any hope of escape, so they resolved to die like heroes, faced the enemy's swords, and struck back their assailants. On both sides, helmets and breastplates were split in pieces by blows from the battle-axe. You might see a lion-hearted savage who had been hamstrung or who had lost his right hand or been wounded in the side, grinding his clenched teeth and casting defiant glances around in the very throes of death. In this mutual slaughter so many were laid low that the field was covered with their bodies, while the groans of the dying and severely wounded filled all who heard them with abject fear. In this scene of total confusion, the infantry, worn out by toil and danger, had no strength or sense left to form a plan. Most had their spears shattered in the constant collisions, so they made do with their drawn swords and plunged into the dense mass of the foe, regardless of their lives and aware that there was no hope of escape. The ground was so drenched with blood that they slipped and fell, and they strained every nerve to sell their lives dearly, and faced their opponents with such resolution that some perished at the hands of their own comrades. In the end, when the whole field was one dark pool of blood and they could see nothing but heaps of the slain wherever they turned their eyes, they trampled without scruple on the lifeless corpses. The sun, which was high in the sky, it was moving into the house of the Virgin after traversing Leo, scorched the Romans, who were weak from hunger, parched with thirst, and weighed down by the burdens of their armour. Finally our line gave way under the overpowering pressure of the barbarians, and as a last resort our men took to their heels in a general rout. While all were scattering in flight over unfamiliar paths, the Emperor was in a situation of frightful peril. He picked his way slowly over the heap of bodies and took refuge with the Lansari and Matari, who stood firm and unshaken as long as they could withstand the pressure of superior numbers. His bodyguard had left him, and when Trajan saw him, he cried out that all was lost unless he could be protected by the foreign auxiliaries. At this, Count Victor rushed off to bring up the Batavi to the Emperor's assistance. They had been placed in reserve not far off, but not one of them was to be found, so Victor retired and left the field. Ricimer and Saturnius saved themselves in the same way. The barbarians' eyes flashed fire as they pursued their dazed foe, whose blood ran cold with terror. Some fell without knowing who struck them, some were crushed by the sheer weight of numbers, and some were killed by their own comrades. They could neither gain ground by resistance nor obtain mercy by giving way. Beside, many lay blocking the way half dead, unable to endure the agony of their wounds, and the carcasses of slaughtered horses covered the ground in heaps. At last a moonless night brought an end to these irreparable losses, which cost Rome so dear. Soon after nightfall, so it was supposed, the Emperor was mortally wounded by an arrow and died immediately. No one admitted that he had seen him or been near him, and it was presumed that he fell among common soldiers, but his body was never found. A few of the enemy were hanging about the field for some time to strip the dead, so that none of the fugitives or local people dared to approach. The Caesar Decius is said to have met with a similar fate. During a hot fight with the barbarians, he lost control of his horse, which stumbled and threw him into a bog. He could not get out, and his body was never found. According to another account, Valens did not expire on the spot, but was taken with a few of his guards and some eunuchs to a farmhouse nearby, which he had fortified. While he was receiving such rude treatment as was available, he was surrounded by the enemy, though they did not know who he was. But he was spared the shame of being taken prisoner. His pursuers tried to break down the doors, which were bolted, but came under arrow fire from the overhanging part of the building. In order not to let this delay rob them of their chance of spoil, they piled up bundles of straw and faggots, set fire to them, and burnt the house, with all who were in it. One of the gods escaped through a window and was taken prisoner. He told them what they had done. which greatly vexed them, because they had lost the glory of taking the ruler of Rome alive. The same men later escaped and rejoined the army and gave this account of what had occurred. A similar disaster befell one of Scipio's after the recovery of Spain. He was burnt to death by the enemy, we are told, in a tower in which he was taking refuge. One thing is certain, neither Scipio nor Valens was given the final honour of burial. Among all the distinguished men who perished, Trajan and Sebastian were outstanding. With them fell 35 tribunes, either in command of units or supernumerary, together with Valerian and Equitus, marshals of the stable and palace respectively. Among them was also Potentius, tribune of the Promoti, who died in the flower of his youth. He was greatly respected by all good men, both on his own account and on that of his father Ursicinus, a former commander-in-chief. It is certain that hardly a third of our army escaped. No battle in our history except Cannae was such a massacre, though more than once the Romans have been the playthings of fortune and suffered temporary reverses, and many disastrous struggles are recorded with grief in the legendary sagas of Greece. The character of Valens. Such was the death of Valens at the age of almost 50 after a reign of a little less than 14 years. I will now speak of his good qualities, which are well known, and of his defects. He was a faithful and reliable friend, and repressed ambitious intrigues with severity. He maintained strict discipline in the army and the civil service, and took particular care that no one should gain preferment on the score of kinship with himself. He was extremely slow both to appoint and to remove officials. In his dealings with the provinces he showed great fairness, protecting each of them from injury as he would his own house. He was especially concerned to lighten the burden of tribute and allowed no increases in taxation. He was mild in his assessment of what was due, and a harsh and bitter enemy of embezzlers and of officials detected in corrupt practices. In matters of this kind no emperor is more kindly remembered in the East. He also combined liberality with restraint. Of this, one example out of the many available will suffice. Courts always contain people eager to enrich themselves at the expense of others. When anyone put in a claim to lapsed property or something of that kind, he drew a clear line between right and wrong, and gave anyone who wished to protest an opportunity to state his case. If he allowed the claim, he often added the names of 3 or 4 absentees as sharers in the grant. As a result, men of restless greed behaved with more restraint, seeing that the profit they had their eye on was diminished by this device. To avoid tedium, I will pass over the buildings which he restored or ordered to be newly erected in various towns and cities, and will leave these works to speak for themselves. In all these respects he set an example, in my opinion, to all right-minded people. Now let me enumerate his defects. He was insatiable in the pursuit of wealth and unwilling to endure fatigue, though he affected enormous toughness. He had a cruel streak, and was something of a bore, with little skill in the arts of either war or peace. He was quite willing to gain advantages for himself from the sufferings of others, and his behaviour was particularly intolerable when he construed ordinary offences as less majesty. Then his rage could be satisfied only by blood and the spoliation of the rich. What was also unendurable was that, although he pretended to leave all suits and trials to the operation of the law and put their investigation into the hands of judges appointed for the purpose, he in fact allowed nothing to be done contrary to his own pleasure. In other ways, too, he was unjust and passionate, always ready to lend an ear to the charges of informers without stifling out the truth from the falsehood. This is a shameful fault and greatly to be dreaded even in private everyday matters. He was dilatory and sluggish. His complexion was dark and the sight of one eye impaired, though this was not apparent at a distance. He was well made, neither tall nor short, bow-legged, and with a somewhat protruding stomach. This is a sufficient account of Valens, and it is amply confirmed by the evidence of my contemporaries, but one circumstance must not be omitted. He had heard from the oracle of the tripod, operated as I described by Patricus and Hilarius, those 3 prophetic lines, of which the last ran, "When Ares waxes wroth on Mimas' plan." Being uncultivated and ignorant, he at first thought nothing of it, but as his troubles multiplied he became abjectly nervous, and the recollection of this prophecy made him tremble at the mention of Asia. He had heard from men of learning that Homer and Cicero had written of a mountain called Mimas, rising above the town of Erythrae. We are told that after his death and the departure of the enemy, a stone monument was found near the spot where he was believed to have fallen, on which was a tablet with a Greek inscription to the effect that in early times a worthy called Mimmius had been buried there. The siege of Adrianople. When dark night covered the earth after the fatal battle, the survivors scattered to right and left in whatever direction panic took them. Everyone was looking for his comrades and thought only of his own safety, fancying that an enemy's sword was about to descend on his head. At a distance could be heard the pathetic cries of those left behind, the sobs of the dying, and the agonized groans of the wounded. At daybreak, however, the victors, like wild beasts maddened by the taste of blood, made for Adrianople in dense hordes, resolved to take it at any cost. What roused their hopes, though to no purpose, was the information they had received from traitors and deserters that the highest officials in the empire, together with the imperial insignia and the treasury of Valens, had been left there for safety in what was thought an impregnable fortress. For fear that the slightest delay might cool their ardour, they surrounded the walls by mid-morning, and a most bitter struggle ensued. The attackers with their native savagery rushed headlong to destruction, while on the other side the defence was roused to a most resolute resistance. A large number of soldiers and their servants who had been refused admission to the city with their beasts stood with their backs to the walls and the houses which joined them, and put up a stout fight, considering the disadvantage of their low position. The mad fury of the attack had lasted until the afternoon, when suddenly 300 of those near the actual parapet formed into a wedge and went over to the enemy, who seized them in a frenzy of excitement and for some unknown reason slaughtered them on the spot. From that moment it was remarked that no one thought of imitating them, however desperate his plight. While this accumulation of horrors was at its worst, torrents of rain accompanied by thunder poured from the black clouds and dispersed the milling hordes. They returned to the circular rampart of their wagons, and went so far in their appalling arrogance as to send an envoy with a threatening letter, ordering our troops to surrender the city on condition that their lives should be spared. The envoy did not dare to come within the walls, and the message was brought by a Christian and read. It was received with the contempt it deserved, and the rest of the day and all the following night were spent in preparations for resistance. The gates were blocked on the inside with huge rocks. The weak sections of the walls were strengthened, and engines were placed in suitable spots to discharge javelins or stones. A sufficient supply of water was also collected. On the previous day, some of the combatants had been so distressed by thirst as to endanger their lives. On their side, the Goths, reflecting on the uncertainties of war and dismayed by seeing their bravest warriors killed or wounded and their strength gradually eroded, formed a shrewd plan, which justice in person brought to light. They suborned some members of the Imperial Guard who had gone over to them on the previous day to pretend to escape and to return to their comrades. They were thus to gain entrance to the city, and having done so to set fire to a designated area. This would serve as a signal, though the besieged would not know its meaning, and while the greater part of them were busy in extinguishing the flames, the city would be left defenceless and might be broken into. The guardsmen carried out the plan and advanced to the ditch, begging with outstretched arms to be admitted to the city as Romans. There was no ground for suspicion, and they were let in, and when they were questioned about the enemy's plans, they gave inconsistent answers. So they were put to the torture and beheaded, after openly confessing what they had come to do. So after extensive preparations, the barbarians, putting behind them the anxiety caused by previous reverses, poured about midnight in enormous numbers against the blocked gates and strove to break the resolution of the defence. But the provincials and court officials joined with the soldiers in a spirited attempt to crush them, and the numbers were so great that their missiles, even when discharged at random, could not fail to inflict injury. Our men noticed that the barbarians were making use of the same weapons as had been hurled at them, so an order was given that the thongs binding the arrowheads to the shaft should be partially cut through before shooting. This did not affect them while in flight, and if they found their mark, they were as effective as ever, but if they missed, they at once fell to pieces. While the fight was at its hottest, a quite unexpected incident had a serious consequence. A piece of artillery called a scorpion, but known in common parlance as a wild ass, which was sighted opposite a dense mass of the enemy, hurled a huge stone. This crushed harmlessly to the ground, but the novelty of the spectacle put such terror into the foe that they shrank back and were in a mind to run. Their chiefs, however, ordered the trumpets to sound, and the battle was renewed. The Romans continued to get the better of it, and hardly a javelin or slingshot missed its mark. The chiefs who filled the front ranks were on fire to lay hands on Valens' ill-gotten riches, and they were closely followed by the rest, eager to be seen to share the danger of their betters. Some were writhing on the ground in a death agony, crushed beneath heavy weights or run through the body by a missile. Others, who were carrying ladders and preparing to scale the wall in many places, were buried under their loads, and stones and fragments and drums of pillars were pushed down on them. But in spite of the ghastly carnage, it was not until late in the day that any of these madmen desisted from his heroic efforts. They were encouraged by the glad sight of the many casualties suffered by the defence, and the fierce struggle for and against the walls went on without intermission. No kind of order was now observed by the enemy, who rushed forward in small groups, a sign of utter desperation. Finally, as evening came on, they all withdrew in dejection to their own camp, accursing one another for reckless folly in not listening to the advice of Fritigern and avoiding the woes of a siege. Vain attempt on Constantinople. The whole short summer night was taken up in giving the wounded such medical treatment as they practice. At dawn they discussed their next step, and after much argument decided to seize Perinthus and then other rich cities in the vicinity. They had full information of these from deserters who were acquainted with the contents of individual houses, let alone cities. In pursuit of this policy, which seemed the best available to them, they advanced slowly, robbing and burning as they went, without meeting any resistance. After the Goths had departed in the neck of time, the defenders of Adrianople, finding from reliable scouts that the enemy had vacated the neighbourhood, marched out at dead of night and took their way by unfrequented routes through the woods, avoiding the highways. Some made their way to Philippopolis and thence to Serdica, others to Macedonia. They took with them such valuables as had escaped damage, and made the best possible speed in the hope of finding Valens in those parts. They were quite unaware that he had died in the battle, or alternatively taken refuge in a hut where he was presumed to have been burnt to death. The Goths, however, in conjunction with some Huns and Alans, brave and warlike peoples endured to hardship, whom Fritigern had shrewdly won to his side by the prospect of wonderful rewards, pitched their camp near Perinthus. Warned by their earlier mishap, they did not dare to approach or attack the city itself, but utterly devastated the wide area of fertile country around it, and either killed the farmers or took them prisoner. They then made a rapid march to Constantinople, keeping in a regular formation for fear of surprise. Its enormous accumulation of wealth aroused their greed, and they meant to make a mighty effort to destroy this famous city. But when their furious onrush had brought them so far that they were almost knocking at the gates, divine providence gave them a check. A body of Saracens, a people of whose origin I have given a full account in various places, had been summoned to the city. They are most at home in the tricks of guerrilla warfare, but on the sudden appearance of the host of barbarians, they made a bold sally from the city to attack it in a formal battle. After a long and obstinate fight, they parted on equal terms, but an incident of an utterly unheard of sort gave the warriors from the east the upper hand. One of them, a man with long hair, wearing nothing but a loincloth, drew his dagger and hurled himself with blood-curdling yells into the midst of the Gothic host. He cut a man's throat, then put his lips to the wound and sucked the streaming blood. This appalling sight terrified the barbarians, who lost their habitual confidence and advanced only with hesitation. Their spirit was further dampened when they contemplated the long circuit of the walls and the huge extent of the blocks of buildings within them, the beauties of the city beyond their grasp, its vast population, and the strait nearby which separates the Black Sea from the Aegean. After suffering greater losses than they inflicted, they dismantled the works they were constructing and left the neighbourhood to spread themselves over the northern provinces, which they traversed as far as the foot of the Julian, or as they were formerly called, Venetic Alps. At this time Julius, who commanded beyond the Taurus, distinguished himself by a swift and salutary deed. Learning of the disasters in Thrace, he sent secret orders to those in charge of the Goths who had been transferred earlier to Asia, and dispersed in various cities and fortresses. These commanders were all Roman, an unusual thing at the present time. The Goths were to be collected quite unsuspectingly outside the walls, in the expectation of receiving the pay they had been promised, and at a given signal all put to death on one and the same day. This wise plan was carried out without fuss or delay, and the provinces of the east saved from serious danger. This is the history of events from the reign of the Emperor Nerva to the death of Valens, which I, a former soldier and a Greek, have composed to the best of my ability. It claims to be the truth, which I have never ventured to pervert either by silence or a lie. The rest I leave to be written by better men whose abilities are in their prime. But if they choose to undertake the task, I advise them to cast what they have to say in the grand style.